Well, so good to hear you guys chattering and talking. Time of meet and greet. Okay, we're going to continue on in our sermon series. Today is the last day of our sermon series we've titled The God Who Is, in which we're going through some of the Old Testament names of God that reveal who God actually is. Today is the final week of that. Next week we start the Gospel of John. I'll be going through that for a couple of weeks, actually a couple of months, years. Actually, I have no idea how long it's going to take. But we're going to be in John part 2, and so we're going to continue on next week. But today's the final week, and so to close this, our lead pastor, Jay Kim, is going to be speaking about a very unique name of God, and it's found in a very obscure story in the Old Testament. And so I'm going to do probably one of the weirdest passages of Scripture. I'm going to do the Scripture reading today. It's a very strange story. It's going to create all sorts of tension in you. You're going to be like, what is this about? Jay will explain. It's going to be amazing. So here it is, Genesis 21, the story of Abraham, a story from the book of Genesis about Abraham. So here it is. At that time, Abimelech, with Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now, therefore, swear to me here, by God, that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my offspring, or with my posterity, but as I have dealt loyally with you, you will deal with me and with the land where you have resided as an alien. And Abraham said, I swear it. When Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs of the flock. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you've set apart? He said, these 7 ewe lambs you shall accept from my hand in order that you may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. When they had made a covenant at Beersheba, Abimelech, with Phicol, the commander of his army, left and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and calling there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham resided as an alien many days in the land of the Philistines. This is the word of the Lord, and together we say, let's take a look at Jay, and then I'll come up at the end.
Hello, it's great to see you, everybody at South Hills and Redwood City. We are so glad you're joining us. Happy Sunday. If I've not met you, my name's Jay, and I'm part of the team here. I am so glad you're here. If you're new or newish to Westgate, a very special welcome to you, and we are honored to host you this morning and so grateful. I know that scripture reading was a bit obscure. It's a strange story, and we'll get into it in a moment. But to get into it, I want to tell you a different story, a more contemporary story. I'll show you a photograph here of a man named Michael Sifre. And Michael Sifre in the 60s and 70s he started out as a geologist. He eventually sort of became a social scientist, and I'll tell you how and why. In 1962, Sifre, as a geologist, wanted to do some research, but where he needed to do the research was 400 feet underground beneath the French Alps. And he knew that the environment would be quite isolating, so he took the opportunity to do a social experiment on top of his research. So in 1962, Sifre descended more than 400 feet into an ice cave beneath the French Alps, and he actually lived there alone for 63 days. No sunlight, no clock, no calendar, no way to know what time or what day it was. He did have a telephone, and the telephone connected to scientists who were monitoring his vital signs, and he would call just a few times a day. And the only times he would call the scientists were to tell them that he had just woken up. He would call them to tell them every time he would eat a meal, and then he would call them to tell them when he was going to sleep for the night. That was the only time. Those were the only moments in 63 days that he had interaction with another human being. And as he did this, his sense of time began to unravel. When Sifre actually eventually came out of the cave 63 days later, He believed, he'd been trying to keep mental track of time. He actually believed that it was late August, when in fact it was mid-September. His body, even though mentally he was trying to keep track of the days and hours, his body had slowed down so significantly. In fact, after he came out, they started doing some very basic timing tests with Sifrei, and they discovered that what his body experienced as 2 minutes was actually about 5 minutes of time. His time in that cave had dramatically slowed his internal clock. Now, what's crazy is Michael Sifrei did this same experiment again about 10 years later. In the early 1970s, he descended into a cave, this time in Texas, and instead of 63 days, this time Sifrei spent 6 months alone in a cave. His body eventually, in this cave in Texas, his body eventually acclimated naturally. It acclimated to staying awake for 30 hours and then going to sleep for 12 hours. So his normal average day expanded to about 42 hours of time. Reflecting on his experience, Sifrei said this: there was a very large perturbance in my sense of time. It's the problem of psychological time. That's an interesting phrase. Psychological time. And then he says, what is time? We don't know. Now that's kind of a silly statement because you and I kind of, on one hand, we know what time is. You look at your watch and you know that the seconds click one by one by one, and it never stops, and it's always the same. Your iPhone tells you what time it is. You guys remember when it was like daylight savings before iPhones, before smartphones, and we'd have to manually change the clocks? Otherwise, we'd wake up, an hour late or an hour early or something. Now it's just like all automated. We know what time is in some ways, but we can also relate to what Sifrei is saying here, because you've probably never spent 6 months in a cave by yourself. That's my guess. Most of us have never done such a thing. But you have experienced, at least in small doses, what Sifrei experienced in the extreme. I'll give you one very simple example that many of you will be able to relate to. When I reflect back on my elementary school years, which happened a long time ago in the 1980s, when I think about first grade to fifth grade, even now as an adult, when I reflect on that season of my life, it feels like during those 5 years, it feels like I lived an entire lifetime. You know what I'm saying? Just think about your elementary school years right now. Doesn't it feel like you were in elementary school for a long time? Like, it certainly feels that way to me. My daughter, Harper, she just finished elementary school, 1st to 5th grade. And when I reflect on her 5 years in elementary school, the same amount of time, for me, when I reflect on her elementary years, it feels like the blink of an eye. That's psychological time. Time is strange this way. Time is sort of elastic, and it is confounding. And I don't mean time on your clock or your phone. I mean time as we experience it. Now, for the last 5 weeks, we've been on this journey, the God who is, present hope in the ancient names. We've been exploring these ancient Hebrew names and descriptors of God, and we've been discovering hope for our lives today. And as we conclude that journey today, we're going to explore a name of God that invites us to reimagine in some ways, or maybe expand our sense of time in light of who God says he is. It's a name that asks us to consider this truth: just as God is everywhere, God is also every when. Have you ever thought about this? Like, most of us believe that the big theological word for it is omnipresence. It simply means God is everywhere all the time. But have you ever considered that if God truly does live and exist beyond space and time, that means that God also, in some ways, is every when? The place where we discover this truth is in this obscure story from the life of Abraham. Genesis 21, verse 33. I'll just read one verse and then we'll get into the rest of the story in a bit. It says that Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Everlasting God. That phrase, everlasting God, in the original language of the text, ancient Hebrew, is the Hebrew phrase El Olam. El meaning God, and Olam we translate as everlasting or eternal, but it's a word that means something much bigger. It really means beyond human comprehension, beyond limited human understandings of time. It means always and perpetual. It doesn't just mean there was a starting point and then it goes on forever into infinity. It means there is no start and no beginning. This is why the scriptures tell us God is Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Now, Abraham, in this story, he declares that God essentially exists beyond time, or at least human understandings of time. God exists beyond comprehension in perpetuity. But here's what's really important to know about the story. Abraham, this man Abraham, many of you know his name. He's called the father of our faith. He did not come to this realization in like an instantaneous moment of epiphany. Abraham came to this realization, this truth, that God is everlasting. He came to this truth through actually long seasons of his life, marked by faltering faith and a very fragile trust. One of the verses that we've been exploring a lot, we've been coming back to time and time again throughout this journey, is Genesis 12, the beginning of Abraham's story with God. And Genesis 12 takes place 25 years before the story today. 25 years before Abraham calls God the everlasting God. 25 years before that, in Genesis 12, God has a conversation with Abraham, or his name at the time was Abram. And God says to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. And then Abraham, or Abram, takes the step of faith. He trusts God and he obeys. It tells us in verse 4, so Abram went. God told him to go, so Abram went, as the Lord had told him. And as he goes, God takes this promise even further. God promises to Abram, or Abraham, not only that he will lead him to a beautiful land, but he promises Abraham that he will give this land to Abraham and his family. Genesis 12, 6-7. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. And at that time, the Canaanites were in the land, and the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring, or to your family, I will what? I will give this land. But this promise, you guys might know Abraham's story. This promise doesn't get fulfilled overnight, does it? In fact, I just told you a few moments ago that Genesis 12 takes place 25 years before today's text. And in today's text, 25 years after the promise was made that God would give Abraham and his family this land, Abraham is still a foreigner there. Genesis 21:34, Abraham resided as what? An alien, a foreigner, an outsider, many days in the land, not of his family, but in the land of the Philistines. If you know Abraham's story, you know that there are other promises he received from God where he had to wait a very long time, right? You guys remember Abraham had been promised by God that he and his wife Sarah would have children. In fact, they would have so many children that his descendants would become a great nation. That was a promise. But you guys might know Abraham and Sarah actually remained childless for decades before that promise is finally fulfilled. Now, Abraham's life, in many ways, it is marked by waiting. And what we see in Abraham's life is that in the waiting, he begins to question God's timing. He begins to lose trust. In the 25 years between Genesis 12 and Genesis 21, we see Abraham's fear begin to deteriorate his faith. We see it time and time and time again. This giant of the faith, we see his anxiety, his impatience begin to run amok. Let me just give you a few examples. In Genesis 12, Abraham lies about his wife Sarah to protect himself in Egypt. In Genesis 15, he questions God's promise of a child. In Genesis 16, Abraham and his wife Sarah grow really impatient about this promise of having a child of their own, so they turn to their slave Hagar to bear them a child. In Genesis 17, Abraham, in fact, he mockingly laughs at God's promise of a child. And then just one chapter earlier in Genesis 20, Abraham had lied again about his wife Sarah to the Philistine king Abimelech. Let me ask you a question. Has God ever felt too slow for you? Like, have you ever felt like, man, God, I trust you. I believe that you love me and that you have good for me and my family and my loved ones and my friends. I do, but come on, the clock is ticking. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever taken matters into your own hands? Like, in my mind and out loud in my life group, I tell people I trust God, but honestly, I'm just gonna have to plan and prod and work my way toward the result that I think God has promised me, but that I'm also not sure he's gonna give to me. Have you ever felt faithless in those moments? Have you ever had that feeling? First of all, I'm asking you these questions because these are all like realities in my own story. You ever gotten to the place where you felt like God was too slow for you? You sort of take matters into your own hands, and then you're kind of racked with a little bit of guilt, a little bit of shame. You start feeling like, gosh, I don't have enough faith. You start comparing your faith to the faith of others. You start looking at people in your life who's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe, wow, they're trusting God with that. What is wrong with me? You ever felt that way? Like a little guilty that you don't seem to have the depth and the richness of faith that maybe other people, at least from the outside looking in, seem to have. If that is you, I just want you to know you are in good company, because Abraham did too. Abraham doubted, he worried, he felt like God was too slow, he laughed at God, he took matters into his own hands time and time and time again. And you know how the Bible describes this man of weak, fragile faith? The New Testament writers talk about Abraham this way, Galatians 3. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Understand then that those who have faith, any faith at all, are children of Abraham. This is why we call him the father of our faith. So those who rely on faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. The man of faith, the father of our faith, was a man whose faith looked much like ours. His faith was often fragile. His faith was often impatient. His faith was often fearful. But here is the good news. The late, great Tim Keller reminds us that it is not the strength of your faith, but the object of your faith that actually saves you. Strong faith in a weak branch is fatally inferior to weak faith in a strong branch. Isn't that astounding? Weak faith is still faith. And let me just relieve the pressure in the room. If you are here today and you feel like your faith is weak, people may not admit it to you out loud, but you should know you are surrounded by people right now who feel very much the way you do. Most of us have weak faith. Most of us have faith that still wonders, it still worries, it still frets. So if you feel weak in your faith today, if all you have is just a glimpse of hope, just a sliver of hope or possibility, it is still faith. It is the object of that faith that matters the most. It is the object of that faith that is strong and steady and sure. Now, by Genesis 21, Abraham has learned, not because his faith is so strong now, but because his faith has endured so much weakness over the years. Abraham has learned a keystone truth, and this is vitally important for all of us today. He's learned this truth, that faith is not just about trusting God's power. Faith is also about trusting God's pace. Most of us, I think, at least intellectually, trust God's power. Like most of us, if you're a follower of Jesus, you probably believe, I know God can. But faith also means I trust that God will whenever he will. Let's read the story one more time. The story leading up, and we'll see this. Again, it is an obscure, strange story. When Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. And Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs of the flock, and Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? And Abraham said, these 7 ewe lambs you shall accept from my hand, in order that you may be a witness for me that I dug this well. In other words, this is my well. Therefore, that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. When they had made a covenant at Beersheba, Abimelech, with Phicol, the commander of his army, left and returned to the land of the Philistines. Okay, again, I know this is a strange story. There's a lot happening here, but here's the key insight. Abraham and his family are still foreigners. In a moment, Abraham is about to call, he's about to name God El Olam, the everlasting God. But he doesn't name God the everlasting God after the promise has been fulfilled. Abraham and his family are still foreigners. In other words, God's promise of giving the land to Abraham and his descendants has not yet been fulfilled. The promise has not yet become the possession of this family. Abraham is still waiting. He's been waiting a quarter century. He's still waiting. He and his family are living in the land God had promised to give them, but he still has to negotiate with a pagan king for basic necessities like water. Think about that for a moment. God told you 25 years ago, you see this is yours. 25 years later, not only is it not yours, you've got to negotiate just to have drinking water. That's Abraham's story in Genesis 21. And then, verse 33, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. El Olam. God, you exist beyond my timing. You exist beyond my understanding. You exist beyond human comprehension. You know, it's really fascinating, actually, that Abraham plants a tamarisk tree. If you know Abraham's story, you know that Abraham and his family, they were nomadic. They were nomads. They lived in tents. They did not plant trees. In fact, this is the only moment, and there are chapters and chapters of stories about Abraham and entire books in the Bible of stories of Abraham's family. And this is the only moment that Abraham plants a tree. This is the only story. Because tents mean we're ready to move on, right? That's what a tent is. A tent is like, I put it up quickly, and then we're nomads. We gotta get going. We don't belong here. This is not our land, correct? This afternoon, My daughter, with like 45 other middle schoolers, will head off up to the American River for our middle school camp. It's going to be so awesome. They're going to sleep in tents. Why? Because they're not going to live there forever. They're coming back Wednesday. That's a tent. It's like, this is temporary shelter. We're not here forever. But what is a tree? A tree takes a long time to grow. A tree builds and grows and develops roots in the ground. A tree means we are ready to stay. Abraham plants a tree in a land that is not his own because he believes God has promised it to him and his family. This is an act of faith. It's interesting about tamarisk trees. They're very slow-growing trees. They often take decades to grow into actual shade trees. What that means is that Abraham is planting a tree he knows he will very likely never fully enjoy. Tamarisk trees are also one of the very few trees that can thrive in desert climates because they grow very deep root systems, they're drought tolerant, and they live for a very, very long time. So again, Abraham plants a tree he knows he will never fully enjoy, but also he plants a tree he knows will endure the test of time. Why? Because he has come to understand faith as trusting not just in God's power, but in God's pace, however long it may take. That's the tamarisk tree. Maybe you're here today and you feel behind in your life. Does anyone feel behind? You feel like, I thought I'd be further along by now. If that's you, I want you to know that Olam means that God is never behind. And God is with you. Maybe you're here today and you just have paralyzing fear about the future. Like you cannot live with the uncertainty of not knowing what is to come. Olam means that God does not fear the future. He sees it all, and he is with you. Maybe you're paralyzed by your past. Maybe the shame and the guilt of your failures just keep you stuck in place, unable to move forward. Olam, everlasting God. It means that God is not finished with the work he is doing, and that God exists beyond time and space. That God is able to touch your present, your future, and he is able to touch with his healing hand your past. Olam means that God's got all the time in the world and all the time beyond the world. Olam means that God is already present in a future you cannot see. Olam means that your failure is never final. It's never final because God can rewrite stories. So what are we supposed to do? I thought I would give you just one very simple practice. We've done entire teaching series on the concept or the idea or the practice of Sabbath. So I won't get into the deep dive of Sabbath. If you're interested, email us and we can link you to previous teachings we've done on Sabbath. But just in short, Sabbath is basically, functionally at least, it is a 24-hour cycle in your life. Usually from sundown to sundown, maybe Friday night once the sun goes down, all the way until Saturday sundown. It's a 24-hour cycle in your life to cease from all of your striving and to embrace the presence of God and others. And there's 4 key movements to Sabbath. First, we set things aside. We stop doing the normal day-to-day stuff. So you might set aside your task list, your emails, set aside some errands or strenuous productivity. Set that aside. Sabbath also moves us into slowing down. Go for a walk or a hike. Just linger in place with friends you love. Rest, relax into God's presence. Sabbath also invites us to delight, enjoy a great meal, play with family and friends, read a good book. And it invites us to worship. That doesn't mean Archie has to show up at your house with the guitar and sing a bunch of songs for you. It means just spending unhurried time in the presence of God with your heart and your mind and your body fixed on his loving presence. The Jewish rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel says that the meaning of Sabbath is to celebrate time rather than space. Most of our lives are spent filling the world of space. And Sabbath is an opportunity for you to remember that time is the most precious commodity we have, and at the same time, to remember that God is everlasting. And someday, after resurrection, we will experience the joy of everlasting. The poet T.S. Eliot, in his poem East Coker, writes this: "In my beginning is my end. In succession, houses rise and fall, crumble, are extended. Houses are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place is an open field or a factory or a bypass. Old stone to new building, old timber to new fires, old fires to ashes, and ashes to the earth. The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless." T.S. Eliot was right. Humility is endless because it is humility. It is the willingness to admit that I am finite, but God is infinite. That I am fixed in space and time, but God is everlasting. That's what allows us to step into everlasting with him. The worship team's going to come back up. I'm going to send things back to South Hills and Redwood City, where Dave and Andrew will conclude your time with you.
I think one of the most arresting things that Jay said in there was God is not just everywhere, he's every when. And I wanted to give us a chance to think about your life. Some of you are carrying significant fears about the future. When your soul's at rest and the noise quiets down, that's where your worries go to, something in the future. Some of you, it's about right now. You're exhausted because life is not going to the timeline that you thought. And that fills you with fear right now. And so when the distractions are gone, your soul thinks about now. Some of you wonder if God's forgotten you right now. Some of you, it's more about the past. You're enslaved by regrets. That you feel like they define you. You wonder how to get free, or something in the past, some broken relationship just keeps coming up. Some moment keeps coming up, and so it's the past. And the quietness, your soul goes back to those moments. I want to give you a moment to quietly reflect, not to fix. These things can't be fixed quickly or resolve it, but rather to simply bring it all to the everlasting God, El Olam, our everlasting God, who was faithful before you were even born, the God who is with you at this very moment, and the God who is already waiting for you in all of your tomorrows. So which one most comes to your heart? Worries about tomorrow, present concerns, or things about the past? Will you just bow your head right now? And in an act of trust, just bring God into that. Say, God, everlasting God, El Olam, the God of yesterday and today and tomorrow. Would you help me right now with whatever it is? Everlasting God, we give you our past. Everlasting God, we give you our present. Everlasting God, we give you our future. Teach us to trust not only your power, but God, also your timing and your pace. Amen.